21. Oh, helps turn the remote on. In Matthew 21, verses 1 through 11, we see that Jesus enters Jerusalem. It's what we often call the triumphal entry. And then 12 through 16, he cleanses the temple and runs out the money changers and responds to the chief priest's challenge there. And then he leaves Jerusalem for the night in verse 17. The very next day, he returns, and we see the story about the fig tree withering. And then verses 23 through 27, we read where Jesus is challenged in the temple once again by the chief priests and elders. And that's when he replies to them with 3 parables. The first is the parable of the 2 sons. The second is the parable of the landowner. And then it's almost like, let's just arbitrarily stick a chapter divide right here and call it Matthew 22. I wish somebody would have a little more common sense, but okay. And so we pick up the third parable that Jesus shares with them in the 22nd chapter in verses 1 through 14, the parable of the marriage feast. And so when we come into Matthew 22, what did I just do? I don't normally hit that button. Hey, now we're cooking with gas. All right, Matthew 22. He tells a parable about the king of who is throwing a wedding feast, and he sends out his slaves, his servants, out to remind the people who he has already invited about this wedding feast. And these servants were rejected. So then he sends them out again. And not only are they rejected this time, but they are mistreated, we read about, and then some are even killed, as we read in verse 6. And then we read the king's response in verses 7 and 8, 9, and 10. And we're going to come back to this response here in a little bit, but when we look at the first part of this, the king comes in and, I went way too far. So the king comes in and he's looking around, he sees his guests, or he sees the space, and he's like, go remind them. So he sends out one. He's already sent out one invitation. That was the normal custom. And I'm thinking about when I'm reading this today, if you're throwing a big party or a lavish wedding, you're going to send out RSVPs. You're going to send out, sometimes if you'll do it like a save the date, and then you'll send out the formal invitation with the RSVP thing, and then there's going to be a Facebook thing and who knows whatever thing nowadays. And there's going to be multiple invitations sent out. And that's what the king did here. He had already sent one. Now he's sending his servants out twice to go and bring these individuals who he had wished to join him at this feast. He wished they would join him, and he tries. And he is rejected. And when we look at this, look at verse 5. They paid no attention, and they went their way. One to his own farm, another to his business. So it's not like there was a life and death emergency going on. One went to his farm, one went to his business. But then the rest simply seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. And the king was enraged, we read in verse 7. And he sent his armies, he destroyed the murderers and set their city on fire. So he didn't tolerate one bit of it to be left. And then he said to his servants, his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main highways, and as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast. Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. And so what we read here is, and when we look at this parable and we apply it the way Jesus wants us to apply it, we see that this king is God. And the invited guests were the Jewish people. But notice God sent how many invitations to the Jewish people? Over and over again. And what did the Jewish people constantly do to his servants, his messengers? And so we see that right off, it's easily being applied. And when the king, God, sees what is happening to his own servants, his messengers, he passes judgment on that group of people. And he passes on and says, you know what, if you don't want to be part of this reward, if you don't want to be part of this grand thing, we're going to open the doors to other people who do want to. And so that's when they go and they find those who are willing to come, both the evil and the good. And verse 11, we read, but when the king came in to look over the dinner guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes. And I want to pause there for half a second, because what that means is, if and I know different weddings today have different dress codes, I guess. But traditionally, you dress up a little bit more for a wedding, and there's an expectation there. And sometimes they'll even say on the invitation that you get, formal attire or black tie or whatever, There is an expectation for how you come and how you dress and how you prepare yourself. And when we go back here and we see that they invited both evil and good, and then we come forward into verse 11, and it points out a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes. It's saying that there is still this expectation that you conform to the rules of society, you conform to the rules of the king. And all the evil and the good made that choice to conform, whereas this one man did not. And so God has outlined this grand purpose for us all. And that's the king's feast. That's the wedding feast. And what it also shows us here is that God's plans are greater than ours. They're greater than and more important than our plans. We may have something important and big in our life going on and something we're working on, something we're wanting to do. But right here we see the judgment that is passed on the people who reject the invitation, who put other things ahead of God, because rejection equals an insult. And when we look at this man who does reject the king, and by coming and to the feast, but not dressed appropriately, as Jesus describes here, we're talking about someone who says, you know what, I'm going to be a Christian, but yet I'm not going to conform to the way that Christ wants me to. I'm not going to live the way that Christ wants me to live. I'm not going to talk the way of a Christian or act the part of a Christian. I'm going to do my own thing still. And what we see here is that the king's response. So we've seen the king's response twice now. The first to the killing of the servants, and the second to someone who says, I'm going to follow you, I'm going to show up, but I'm not going to live the right way. We see two responses, and they're the exact same response. He clearly gets rid of the sin and the evil and the things that are not according to his will. And so the man he says, "How did you come here without wedding clothes?" And then the king said to the servants, "Bind him hand and foot, throw him into the outer darkness." Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Excellent point. Excellent point. Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, he clearly knew what he was doing. He clearly had heard and chosen at one point to follow along, but then chose at some point. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the thing. This as I was studying this, it hits for me a little bit because I love. You all know me. I love food. I'm a foodie, and I love big cooking and everything. And I love having people over. I just we can't, you know, we can't have everybody over all at once. So if you want to schedule a time, just let me know and pitch in, and we'll fire up the black stove. Mike, you're come on over. Um, we did big breakfast yesterday morning on the Blackstone. And it was great. But and so I love the idea of bringing people in and and sharing with others, and that's what God is doing here. He's trying to share greatness, something beyond greatness, with people, and the people He has originally chosen reject Him. And so then he's like, okay, well, you reject me, I will go find those who won't reject me. I'll find the people who are willing and to come to me and do the things that I ask. Mike, were you just volunteering to eat, or were you having a comment? Okay, come on over, man. Yeah. Yeah. And it is purely arrogant, and um, I, d- I would also argue that there's a mathematical issue here. I'm God is one God. Can He do all this? Yes, He can. But He is one God. He should not have to conform to the billions and billions of people that have existed and lived throughout the history of the world. Instead, they ought to conform to the one way. And Jesus is going to bring about this idea of one thing here in just a little bit when we get there. Todd. And so we've hit, that hits right here on. Did I hit the wrong button? I turned it off again. I'm winning. And that hits at this point. For many are called, but few are chosen. Many are called, few are chosen. It really is. Take a single candle and light it in a dark cave, and that's what you have in essence. Very, very few are chosen among the many. But there's a difference here, and that's something else I want to point out is there's a difference between a call and a response. You know, we look at the invitation that we have here, the call. We have to be willing to respond. Someone has to be willing to respond to that call. Mike?
Two things. I don't want to get too complicated here. First thing, this passage is misunderstood a lot of times because it says, "But few are chosen." That word "are" is not in the scripture.
Mm-hmm.
It's not in the Greek. It says, "But few chosen," and the declension of that word, that's electos in Greek. Electos, those that elect, those that choose. So the way that should be written is, "For many are called, but few choose."
Very good.
Elect to do so.
Yeah.
It's not that they are chosen, but they choose.
I appreciate that. I hadn't even seen that, so I appreciate that. I want to put these three parables briefly together because I think we do a disservice if we don't. Jesus tells three parables at the same time, back to back to back, and in all three, you have a father figure, a powerful figure, and that is God. And then you have people who are um, claiming to be loyal and faithful, and then they turn out not to be. And then we see in the mistreatment and in a couple of these of 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 the king's servants or the landowner's servants, and then we see the kind of the summation of this. And Jesus in the first parable tells them at the very end that the people that oh, I didn't know what Andy was up to. Sorry, Andy. Jesus tells the leaders that the people that they look down on, those are the ones that are going to enter heaven first, because those are the ones who are willing to listen. Those are the ones willing to obey. In the second parable, Jesus concludes by saying the kingdom's going to be handed over to a different group of people, referring to those who would accept Jesus. And then in the third, he talks about the punishment, the consequence. And I want to point out here that we don't like talking about punishment a lot. Our world doesn't like talking about punishment. They want to take God and make him like this all great grandfather figure. But the reality is this king gave many, many, many invitations. He put a lot out there for the people. And he invited them and invited them and invited them. And they rejected him every single time, by and large. And so, obviously, there's got to be a consequence. Something is going to be done. Otherwise, there's no actual justice here. And so, we see that the kingdom's going to be handed over, but then look at the consequences for those who killed the slaves and mistreated the slaves and the messengers of God. But then also look at the consequence, the positive consequence, the positive aspect for those who were willing to follow Jesus and to clothe themselves in righteousness. They came into the feast. They received the reward. And so I think it's important to see these three things put side by side. And then Matthew 22, verses 15 through 22, Jesus is approached by the Pharisees, and actually it's their disciples, their students, and I'm probably going to refer to them as the students of the Pharisees, just because you start saying disciples and it can get a little confusing. But these disciples of the Pharisees come to Jesus, and they butter him up, or they try to flatter him, and they say, "We know you're truthful and teach the way of God in truth. And so tell us, is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not?" And this is a question that the scholars of that day debated quite a bit. And they're trying to entrap Jesus, because if he says yes, it allows the Pharisees the opportunity to denounce him, and because they are anti-Rome. But if he says no, then the Pharisees are just going to go and tell the Romans, "Hey, you got someone committing sedition and treason over here, telling people don't pay your Roman tax." So it's a lose-lose situation for Jesus, so they think. And what he does is extremely smart. Obviously, it's Jesus, so he has that wisdom and that insight. But he has them hand him a coin, and he says, "Look at the imprint on it. Look at the picture on it. Who is that on there?" And he says to them in verse 21, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's." It doesn't just say give, render. It's Caesar's anyway, so give it back to him. But then notice how he says the second part of this. And to God. He's piggybacking off that first part of the statement. If you're going to render to Caesar the things that are his, if you're going to forcefully give, return back to Caesar what are his, and to God, and give back to God the things that are God's. That's his point here. You give to the government what is the government's, but you give to God what God deserves and what is his rightfully. And I think that is a very important point here, that he is not endorsing a specific earthly government. He's not endorsing a lifestyle. He is simply saying, this is an earthly matter, and if it's his, give it back to him. But when it comes to God, you give it back to God. And then 23 through 33, he's approached by Sadducees. And before we talk about this, let's understand who the Sadducees are for a minute. These are a group of people that they're kind of the upper echelon of the society. They only accepted the Pentateuch, meaning the first 5 books of the Bible, as God's word. They rejected the rest of the Old Testament, as well as the oral traditions and laws. They rejected the idea of the immortality of the soul, life after death, punishments and rewards. They rejected the resurrection from the dead. Why? Because Moses did not specifically say anything about it. But yet we know that's what they believe, because we see in Acts 23 and verse 8, where we read, "For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all." So there's a distinction here between your Pharisees and your Sadducees. So this is going to be the Sadducees that come and try and entrap Jesus in these passages here, in this next section. So they come and they say, if a man dies having no children, his brother as next of kin shall marry his wife. Now, we're not going to read all this, but that is referring to what's called the Levirate law that we see in Deuteronomy, the 25th chapter, where if a older brother dies, then without an heir, then his wife is supposed to be married off to the next younger brother. And it was a common practice in ancient societies. It was a common practice in the Old Testament. It was, and it was taken seriously too. Notice Judah's son Onan failed to keep this law, and he was punished for it. So they come to him and they offer him Jesus, an absurd situation, because they're like, there is no way. There's 7 brothers. That part I get. My grandfather was one of 11 children. I get that part. But 7 brothers, and you got one lady who's married to all 7 eventually, and none of them have kids. So there's something there. This is just absurd anyway. It's absurd to a male-dominated society that a woman would have 7 husbands. It's absurd that a woman would be married 7 times and not have at least one child unless she was infertile. And they knew it was absurd, and that's why they asked him. So let's just get that out there. But notice what Jesus responds with, because they're asking, and they don't even recognize the resurrection. That makes it even more absurd. So in the resurrection, they say in verse 28, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had married her. And this is where Jesus is once again shows his fantastic nature. He says in verse 29, you are mistaken. You're not understanding the scriptures nor the power of God. For the resurrection, in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage. Who's given in marriage? Males or females? Women, females. Then, and that's what he's saying here, is you see the contrast here. There's neither marry, meaning the men who go and marry the girl or the female, nor are given in marriage, meaning the female. And instead, they are like angels in heaven. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? You know, he's making this reference to like angels in heaven. Angels don't marry. Angels don't procreate and have kids. He's making that very clear to them, that they don't understand the scriptures. And then he talks to them about the resurrection itself, because they say, well, it's not specifically said in the Pentateuch. But notice what Jesus does. He brings up Exodus, the 3rd chapter. And he says to them, what was spoken to you, meaning to your forefather by God, verse 32, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. That is active language right there. That is living language. That is not past tense. It is an active tense right there. I am the God of Abraham. I am standing here. I am sitting in this pew. He says, God told Moses, I am the God of your father, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, as if they are still living at that time. And then Jesus says, he is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And so he's making a point to them that even though it doesn't explicitly say, there is a resurrection at the second coming of a Messiah in the Pentateuch, there are allusions to this in the way that God talks and the things that they are taught in the Old Testament. We get into 34 and 40 through 40, and the Pharisees come back to him. And they try and ask him, what is the greatest commandment? And he said to them, and here he quotes 2 passages, Deuteronomy 6 verse 5 and Leviticus 19 verse 18. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second meaning the follow-up, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So he says the first one is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. But then the second one is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And this is the question to the class. If each of you, including myself, love the Lord with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind, how are we going to treat our neighbor? How are we going to treat the person who is being rude to us driving down the road? How are we going to handle the difficult boss? How are we going to handle our child who doesn't want to listen to us one day? How are we going to handle church discipline? How are we going to handle anything? Love your neighbor as yourself. That's how we handle it. And he says in verse 40, on these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. He's making sure that they understand that the whole law and the prophets, it represents the entirety of the Old Testament, the entirety of what they have always been taught and learned. It hangs on these two. And I think he's pointing this out to them for good reason, because what were they guilty of not doing? Loving their neighbor.
And more importantly, they didn't love God because they didn't obey what he told them to do. They rejected Jesus.
Yeah. You know, and we're going to see this later on. And we see this in how they lived. You know, they were so caught up in dealing with the minutia, the small stuff, and making sure that, you know, they're paying taxes on every little seed and morsel, but yet and that meant they were being holy and righteous, but yet they couldn't treat their neighbor very nicely the way that they were supposed to. So they were skipping a very major part of this. That is. Mm-hmm.
That's one of the first things of the 7 things he hates: a haughty look or attitude.
Yep.
There's several scriptures in the Old Testament that say that God hates arrogance, and it will not go unpunished.
Absolutely. Mike, did you have something?
Well, I mean, these people were the leaders of the Jews, and they had these ideas that they clung to and were drawing lines. These are doctrinal matters, and they were wrong. And Jesus points that out. They were blind. It's true they didn't see the truth of Scripture because of their own agenda. And obviously, the same thing does happen today and can happen in any Bible study.
Yeah.
Are there things that we hold to because it's been handed to us, and we never examine to see if it really is what God gifted, and do we have the humility to correct that and conform to what He wants? That was their problem. But these were the leaders.
Yeah.
That shows the power of pride, like you mentioned.
Yeah. Todd and then Mike.
Many of the miracles that Jesus performed on a certain day.
Mm-hmm.
On the Sabbath. That was not by mistake, right? And then you had people that were trying to correct him. He said, pray to God, because you're the man that conceived from birth down to conceived. They're questioning him, how dare you do this on Saturday? How dare you do this on Saturday? There's a difference in doing everything to the letter of the law and loving it, right? They had no love in their heart. None. We need to be careful with that also.
Oh yeah.
I mean, back in 1 John chapter 5, if you love God, you will keep His commandments. The reason you're going to keep His commandments is not keep the letter right. It's because you love God.
And I mean that's the thing. They treated it like a checklist, a daily checklist of did I pray this many times? Did I show this? Did I do that? And they treated it almost as if I hit all the check boxes then I got my point sheet or I got my check marks for the day. And that's not how God operates. Absolutely. Absolutely, Mike.
There are types of Sadducees today. We may not realize it, but I was talking to a fellow one time, and with the Romans, and he said, "Oh, that was Paul." Trying to build a relationship. That was Paul. And I said, "Well, what's your problem with that?" He said, "Well, I only go by the words of Jesus, the words he read in the Gospels, because that other stuff that was written, that was just somebody's opinion." Well, that's sort of like the Sadducees. I only go by what Moses wrote, not by what any of the prophets wrote.
Yeah,
So yeah, that's the mindset out in the world today.
absolutely. And looking at verses 41 through 46, Jesus responds to them again. And here he poses a question that they cannot answer. He says, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" And they did answer this part of the question, and they answered it correctly. The son of David. Okay, good. But then he said to them in verse 43, "Then how does David in the Spirit, meaning inspired by the Spirit, back uh, years before, ages before, call him Lord, saying in Psalm 110, verse 1, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath your feet. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And so he poses this deep question to these individuals who are supposed to be learned in the law and the scriptures, and they can't answer. And the only way that a descendant of David, who Jesus was, both through his parental lineage and through God, the only way that he could be both the son of David as well as Lord over David is to be deity. That's the only way. And so we see this transition here of Jesus being the son of David to Jesus being the Lord of David. And with that, they couldn't respond to him the rest of the day. So as we head into Matthew 23, we see what's called in our headlines in our Bibles a lot of times called Phariseeism exposed. And this segment occurred in the temple with Jesus talking to a group of people, a large group. It says crowds, so that tells us there's a lot of people there. And I want to show this to you a little differently because it's really hard to read this. You can read it, but it's easier if you break it apart, almost like a lawyer's accusation, a lawyer's brief against the Pharisees. So when you break it apart, here's his accusations that he levies against the Pharisees. He says, the scribes and the Pharisees, in verse 2, have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. So he's accusing them of preempting God, preempting the old law, putting themselves higher than both of those two things. In verse 3, they say things and do not do them. Verse 4, part A, they tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders. For B, they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. 5a, they do all their deeds to be noticed by men. 5b, they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. Now, if you don't know what a phylactery is, neither did I until about 18, 20 hours ago. Because a phylactery, if you want to notice in this picture, that little box that's like on this guy's head, that's a phylactery. And they would write little prayers and put it in there. And then they would put prayers and things and wrap them around their arms. And so they're doing that to make themselves appear more holy. Verse 6, they loved the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues. They love to be seen. And then verse 7, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by men. So they like to be recognized in that way as well. They like to be respected above all. So they want to be seen and they want to be kind of respected above other people. And then notice what he tells the crowds. He warns them. He implores them. All that they tell you to do, do and observe. But do not do according to their deeds. What they tell you to do according to the law, that's what you need to do. But don't do according to their deeds. Do not be called rabbi. For one, here we go, one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But, verse 11, but the greatest among you shall be your servant, which we've studied before, and he follows that up. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled and brought low, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. But woe to you, scribes, and now he starts in on what's 7 woes, and then there's an 8th woe in Matthew that is included. And he starts breaking this down, and he starts saying that these are things to be aware of. And I think we're out of time. So we're going to pick up here on Wednesday night, and head into hopefully 24, maybe 25. Thank you all.